and it has been coordinated and implemented by the Finnish Institute of International Affairs in cooperation with the European Commission's Directorate-General for Reform Support. The project seeks to develop processes and analytics to support risk management and enhance strategic-level public-private dialogues concerning geoeconomic risk. Our first speaker today is Risto Vuohelainen, who will deliver the opening words. Risto Vuohelainen is CEO and Executive Director at Business Finland. He leads the internationalization services at National TPO Business Finland. He has over 30 years of international sales and business management experience in several industries, including packaging, electronics manufacturing, and nanotechnology. Director Vuohelainen, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this interesting and so timely seminar about navigating geoeconomic risks. Today you will hear from researchers how the geoeconomic risk of the world is changing the total risk management of the companies. You also hear their recommendations how to help the nation and companies to tackle this risk together in this more complex world. So my name is Risto Vuohelainen. I'm heading the internationalization services in the National Trade Promotion Organization, Business Finland. The geoeconomics and other geopolitical issues are very important now that the world is recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic. However, in the same time, the political challenges in the Western world are getting more serious. Whether the challenges are coming from aggressive behavior, human rights violations or unfair trade, they give us a new challenging environment for doing business. And you can all see this when you open the news in the morning, that what happens in the world today. But to give you a short glimpse of what has happened in the business in the past years, I would like to show you some numbers from the Finnish exports. The good news, what I wanted to tell you all in the beginning, is that despite what a lot of people are saying, Finnish exports are actually doing well. The exports have risen recent years, and Finnish companies have found new export countries around the world. The overall exports from Finland between 2016 and 2021 grew over 30%. The larger corporations, it took longer time to recover in Finland from the 2008 financial crisis. But actually the export of small and medium-sized companies have recovered much more faster. And during the last years, the export of the small and medium-sized companies have doubled. I was going to say that on the slides, the small and medium-sized companies, the exports are goods and the services, and it's coming from the tax authorities. All right, let's continue. Well, why I wanted to talk about this SME exports is that that's very important for Finland. Historically, about 100 companies have been doing over 2/3 of Finnish exports. So Finland needs more of these kind of middle-sized companies and also to grow them bigger. And in Finland, we are doing this work every day. We're giving the advice for Finnish companies in Finland for their internationalization plans, and our 140 people around the world are giving advice for the local behavior, the local contacts, and we have 40 offices around the world. But even if we look at the historical data, it's not showing us what's going to come in the future. The past years have shown that there is quite a new unforeseen risks that are coming. I don't think that anybody in here a year ago, or at least 2 years ago, would have believed that Finland would lose its fourth biggest trade partner overnight. And this was, of course, because of the Russian attack in Ukraine. And the sanctions towards Russia came very fast. But it's not only the sanctions that was the reason for this drop with the trade. It's also the public opinion. I heard a lot during that time, about 10 months ago, from people that they didn't want to buy anything that is manufactured in Russia, even if it would have been made with foreign companies. They said, for example, that they were looking who is making the tires for their cars, and if the tires are manufactured in Russia, they would not buy them, they would buy something else, even if it would have been a Finnish company. The public opinion can fast turn into really a negative purchase behavior. And companies need to look closer on these kind of risks. Are they coming from climate change, human rights issues, or geopolitics? To achieve this, the companies need more information for their analysis and thinking preventive measures. For the future risk that there is coming from geoeconomic surroundings. In future to come, the companies can face even more situations. It could be so that some area or some country is actually blocked, and this could be like the Russian sanctions, or it could be like that there was the new rules from the US Commerce Department a month ago that some of the most advanced electronics chips are not able to be sold to the Chinese companies. Or it could be that companies can find that their competitors have a more lucrative financial support that is not accepted in European Union. I hear this a lot with, for example, in energy business, on companies who are competing against Chinese companies. Or thirdly, there might also come restrictions about the research collaboration because of the national security issues. I think that nowadays there's a lot of discussion about the quantum computing and also about the artificial intelligence, where we see this. Well, companies need actually the tools how they monitor and mitigate these risks and how they understand the geoeconomic in the future. They need to get the information. And I think that here the public players have a lot of things to bring to this table. And I think like Minister of Foreign Affairs have a very big role on this to find the information, read these silent signals and bring them to the audience and companies. Secondly, of course, there is a need for the robust private-public information sharing and collaboration. And to make this happen, the information sharing needs to be very open. The companies and public partners need to be open and share their information, and the dialogue must be two-way street. Dear guests, this is why we are here today. The report will give you ideas, tools, and also recommendations how to understand and tackle this risk. But I think it's better I let the researchers speak for themselves. Thank you.
So it is now my pleasure to introduce to you the three experts who will introduce the report in the following. So first off is Mikael Wigell, who is a research director at FIIA, the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. He is also an adjunct professor of international political economy at Tampere University and a member of the World Economic Forum Expert Network. His work on geoeconomics and economic statecraft has been published in several top-ranked international academic journals, such as International Affairs and World Development. He is one of the editors of the book Geoeconomics and Power Politics in the 21st Century, the revival of economic statecraft. Second is Heikko Borchert, who owns and manages Borchert Consulting and Research, a strategic affairs consulting boutique. He's also co-director of the Defense AI Observatory at Helmut Schmidt University of the Federal Armed Forces, a senior research fellow at the German Institute for Defense and Strategic Studies, associate fellow at the Center for Advanced Security, Strategic and Integration Studies, and a subject matter expert at the Hague Center for Strategic Studies. His latest book as an editor is Storms Ahead, The Future Geoeconomic World Order. And the third expert is Christian Fjäder. He's currently heading the Geostrategic Intelligence Group, a private boutique consulting agency. He was Senior Research Fellow at FIIA during the project, and prior to that, Director for Policy Planning and Analysis at the National Emergency Supply Agency in Finland, with responsibilities in strategy development, international relations, and analysis and research coordination. So please, Director Wigel.
Thanks a lot, Katja. And so yes, indeed, with Heikko and Christian, we'll be presenting the report that was published a week or two ago, and that we've been working on for a little over a year right now already. So we started this project, of course, already way before the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine. And at the time, our sort of main idea with this work was really to find out to what extent business is aware of geoeconomic risks, how they deal with them, and how they prepare for geoeconomic risks. So we started with a survey with companies in several countries in Europe. We also did more in-depth interviews and case studies with a number of companies in several countries in Europe. What we found out was that actually companies are not very well aware, not very well prepared to geoeconomic risks. And that was a bit of a surprise, perhaps, to us. We had hoped to also learn very much from existing corporate risk frameworks in order for us to sort of be able to conceptualize a bit better geoeconomic risk and how the sort of rise of geoeconomics affects the corporate sector. But it was quite striking how kind of deficient the awareness perhaps was and the preparedness to it. Some of that, of course, illustrated then with Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine and the outfall from it. So what we now try to do in this report is really to identify what's geoeconomic risk, how can we assess geoeconomic risk, how can we monitor it, and provide some tools for that would really also be of use, not only to public authorities, but very much also to the private sector, to businesses as such. Because geoeconomic risk is very different from traditional political risk. Traditional political risk really focuses very much on country risk, whereas geoeconomic risks are transnational. And that's a very, very different environment where we sit right now than, let's say, 10 years ago. So the risk frameworks ought to be very different in order to be able to invoke geoeconomic risks. They're not entirely novel, but there are a lot of geoeconomic risks that are much more prominent these days and are also a bit different from before. So let me just start by setting the stage here a bit. and talk a bit about what's geoeconomics as such, and what's behind this rise of geoeconomics. What does it really entail? And also, of course, to talk a bit about geopolitics and the sort of return of geopolitics that we see especially with Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine. So I'll first look a bit at the rise of geoeconomics and then on the sort of return of geopolitics and what sort of implications that has, especially for business. So let's start with geoeconomics. So when we talk about geoeconomics, we really talk about power politics. The way power politics is being waged by economic means. Great powers, be it China, be it US, be it European Union, are engaging in power politics, but more and more with economic instruments. We have come a long way from the 1990s when economic interdependencies were seen as something positive, something stabilizing, something that led to cooperation and integration. These days, economic interdependencies are seen to carry with it risks and vulnerabilities, and that's a big change. So economic interconnectivity, interdependencies comes with risks and vulnerabilities. We've all become aware of that, of course, today when there is more and more an effort to balance against these economic dependencies and perhaps also wean ourselves off them. So geoeconomics is really about how states drive their strategic objectives by way of economic means and economic power. So economic interdependencies are seen, and central in that is, of course, that these interdependencies provide opportunities for power play. We can use those states can use those interdependencies to drive, to manipulate other countries, to get political capital over, to drive their strategic objectives by manipulating these interdependencies. That's also now why we see the state coming very much back into the economy. So we have a lot of new instruments, not only for offensive geoeconomics, but also for defensive geoeconomics. States need to protect themselves from this sort of geoeconomic power politics. So what's essentially happening is that economic and security thinking is becoming intermeshed. 10 years ago, those were still different zones of policy making. You had economic policymakers were one gang and security policymakers another gang, and they rarely spoke with each other. These days, they do. A lot of economic policymaking are being done with security interests in mind and security interests being taken into account. So let's just look a bit on how states actually go about this economic power politics. What is geoeconomic statecraft? I think it's not very well understood always. I think there's been far too little discussion about what's in it for states here. So let's start with the first geoeconomic strategy, which is economic coercion. So this is about using often sanctions, of course, to drive strategic objectives. All economic flows can be used as a means for economic coercion. Trade, finance, currencies, migration can be used as a means for this sort of power politics, as we've seen in recent years. For the US, economic coercion has, of course, this geoeconomic strategy of coercion has become a central strategy in US foreign and security policy making. The use of sanctions has gone through the roof if we go back in and look at sanctions data. Especially the US uses a lot of financial sanctions and to drive all sorts of objectives, not just when it comes to terrorism or rogue states, so to speak, but in a lot of different issue areas. Sanctions are usually, we think about sanctions as a strategic weapon, it's usually wielded in 3 stages. First, you threat that we will, if Russia doesn't draw back its troops from the Ukrainian border, we will slap sanctions on you and you will hurt economically. If that doesn't work, we move into the second stage of sanctioning. That's the limited use of sanctions, when you slap a few sanctions on Russia to show resolve, that we're really serious here now. If you don't withdraw, we will hurt you, and this will hurt you. We know that didn't function with Russia. Russia started its invasion of Ukraine. That's where we moved into the third stage of sanctions, which we can call actually economic warfare. In that stage, it's not so much anymore about getting Russia to withdraw from Ukraine. It's about weakening Russia, to really weakening its economic power and its ability to wage war in other theaters as well. That's where we are now, and that will hurt Russia very much, of course, because Russia is very dependent on a lot of economic flows from the West, including technological flows for upgrading its own military might. Sanctions usually come with primary and secondary aims, and this is important to note, because I hear a lot of loose talk about sanctions not working. Well, first of all, sanctions don't work usually very well in the second stage, in the limited use stage, but they do work in the third stage. They are often very effective. These new types of sanctions that we have these days, they are effective in weakening, for instance, Russia or other countries. But there are also secondary aims with sanctions. If we think about the current sanctions against Russia, they do not only have to do with Russia, they also have to do with China, signaling to China that if China has any plans on attacking Taiwan, there will come sanctions and they will hurt. So there are signaling aims with sanctions as well. Good to keep in mind. Sanctions have very broad effects these days. They have very broad effects for companies as well, of course. The secondary sanctions, secondary financial sanctions the US is using, they concern companies all around the global economy that are part of the dollar-based trade economy. And of course, sanctions have decoupling effects. The more US uses sanctions, the more other countries will become concerned about becoming a possible target for sanctions, becoming vulnerable to sanctions, the more they will start to decouple from the US economy. And we might start to see alternative financial institutions starting to pop up. China is very much investing in that, in those alternative institutions, in the digital yuan, in the SIP system as an alternative to the SWIFT system, and other institutions. So that's what we now already see be going on in the world economy, that there are these efforts to wean themselves off this very much US-based financial system. The second big strategy when we think of geoeconomic statecraft is what I call binding. This is, if coercion is about sticks, binding is about carrots, providing carrots to other countries to bind them up to yourself. China has been doing that very successfully for the last 20 years. It has provided investments, loans, these big infrastructure projects, and through that made other countries dependent on China, and through that China gains political leverage as well, political influence in those countries. And we see that some of the countries that have become economically very dependent on China, they start to vote together with China in international organizations, for instance. This binding strategy is often a subtle and very smart strategy of playing this sort of geoeconomic power politics. And it has been, of course, it's not a new strategy. The Marshall Aid back in the days was a smart strategy for binding up countries like Italy or Greece that were on the verge of weaning over to the Soviet Union's space. With Marshall Aid, the US was able to bind them up into the sort of liberal order. The third strategy in geoeconomics is what I call wedging. That's when you try to drive a wedge through an alliance or a country, manipulating both sticks and carrots. Russia actually used that quite successfully for many years in Europe. It provided very lucrative energy contracts to some countries in Europe, including Germany, of course, that ended up very dependent on Russia, and wherefore Germany is now in a bit of a difficult bind. It provided very bad contracts to other countries in Europe, or it even closed off the gas flow, so to speak, for some countries. Those countries in Europe had very different interests when it came to Russia, and it was difficult for Europe in many ways to come around for a common line how to deal with Russia then. So, and also, nothing came out of the EU's plans on an EU energy union. Russia was very successful in driving this wedge through Europe through this sort of geoeconomic energy politics. That's, of course, not very successful anymore because Russia, with its own reversal back to traditional geopolitics, has been undermining its own capability of continuing that sort of geoeconomic wedge strategy. Corruption networks is another another effective means of wedging, of course. We've seen that in many instances already, also before. The fourth and last geoeconomic strategy is what I call hedging. That's a defensive strategy. Because of coercion, binding, and wedging, you need to defend yourself against those sort of offensive geoeconomic statecraft. You need to hedge your bets. You need to diversify your economy so as not to end up so dependent on one supplier, say Russia in energy. Germany forgot to hedge in the energy sphere, I'd say. So that's about diversification, about supply security, about certain amount of self-sufficiency, creating self-sufficiency. It's also about perhaps also integrating with other friendly countries more in order to be able to withstand geoeconomic coercion, binding, and wedging. This is what we see all around the world right now. Countries hedging. Countries are balancing against dependencies, against strategic dependencies, so as not to end up as a pawn in this geoeconomic power politics. And that's why our operating environment in the world economy is changing very heavily right now. We're actually moving, because of this hedging, very much into another economic model. So here's just a comparison of three economic models. On the right-hand side, you have state capitalism. That's the Chinese model, where state intervention is very broad in almost all economic sectors. State intervention is done very much for political reasons. It's to prop up the Communist Party and the regime as such. The president and the Communist Party needs control of economic sectors to keep itself in power. And it goes with the ideology, of course, to some extent as well. So you end up with state-corporate relations being very close. Our traditional model in the West has been the opposite almost. It has been sort of a market capitalist model, right, where state intervention is very limited in the economy. When state intervention happens, it's because of economic reasons, to create efficiency, productivity into the market, to make market function better and more efficiently. Therefore, state-corporate relations are very distant. Where we're now moving, what we sort of identifying in this report as well, is that we're moving in the West very much to what we call a strategic capitalist model, strategic economics, where state intervention is becoming, there's more state intervention, but it will be selective. There will be state intervention in strategically security important sectors. Sectors where there are heavy security considerations, technology, for instance. There's the state will start to intervene more heavily, where other sectors are left to sort of a laissez-faire framework. So the goal with state interventions are very much security-driven instead of economic-driven that there was before. And therefore, we also have state-corporate relations which are very varied. They will be close in some strategic sectors. They will be distant in other sectors. This, of course, changes the operating environment for business as well very much. And there are new risks involved with this sort of economic model, risks that were not there when we still lived in a market capitalist framework. So we need to reevaluate a lot of the assumptions about the functioning, how the global economy is functioning. I would just very quickly look at three prominent trends with this rise of geoeconomics. It's the weaponization, the securitization, the balkanization of the global economy. And we quickly just look at a bit of the EU's new economic agenda and the impact of great power relations on the economy. So let's start from a weaponization of the economy. Economic policy is used as a strategic weapon these days. So we have sanctions has become a central means for the great powers, especially US and Europe, but increasingly so also for China when they drive their strategic objectives. We have new sanctions against individuals and companies. That's something novel as well. We didn't used to have these sorts of sanctions which are targeted directly against companies and individuals. And there are lots of them these days. Companies used for espionage, that's a risk these days. We have a lot of cases where companies, voluntarily or involuntarily, are used for espionage purposes. And we have strategic corruption where actors in the national system purposefully try to corrupt individuals, companies, or other actors in other societies in order to bind them up to itself and get political leverage through that. That's something to be very careful about, of course. So vulnerability to sanctions, corruption, espionage are very much increasing in today's world economic environment. The other big trend, securitization of the economy. So the security sensitiveness is very much increasing. States are doing economic policy making with security interests in mind more and more. That's why we have all these new instruments popping up. We have FDI screening mechanisms. We have export controls and restrictions. Think about the US restrictions on technology exports to China, for instance, these days. They are becoming quite heavy, and they affect not only American companies, they affect European companies as well. We have new science and technology cooperation restrictions, data localization restrictions. We have all the new subsidy packages, which are also the friend and ally shoring. This is a new, again, something which we didn't used to see, these huge packages of subsidies, be it for semiconductors or other spheres. So we're starting to see broader state control, state intervention, especially in security-sensitive sectors. The EU is, of course, doing this very much as well. Here's just a list of some of the new directives and initiatives that the EU is working on, which has to do with this securitization of the EU economy. This is a very different policy agenda, economic policy agenda, from what we used to be, what we were used to in the EU. It really takes us into another economic model, more from market capitalism into more of a strategic capitalist model in the EU as well. That, of course, comes with new risks for businesses as well. The third and last trend, the balkanization of the global economy. We're starting to see more disintegration of global economic networks into these smaller ecosystems. Especially we see that in technological sectors, where decoupling of the supply chains have taken up some speed. And we, of course, see in the international standard-setting regimes more and more competition. And that's, of course, a worrying thing, that the globalization has been underpinned by how market actors have been able to come to agreement over the standards when it comes to technology, so that we can use our mobile phones anywhere in the world or our credit cards anywhere in the world. This is not the case going forward, perhaps. New technologies, all new technologies need to be, there need to be standards around how they can be used, and that they can be used broadly around the globe. And there are more and more competition over those. So we see this sort of signs of more competition over these technological spheres of interest. And that, of course, comes with big risks for both the public and private sectors, especially those involved with technology innovation. Are we approaching a new Cold War? Well, if we look at US-China, what sort of decoupling there's going on, it really goes on in the technological sphere. But if we think of a new Cold War, it will certainly look different from the old Cold War. The old Cold War was about geopolitics, traditional geopolitics. It's about territorial control through military means. If we are approaching some kind of new Cold War here, it will really take place mostly on the economic field, not by military means. It will take place, the strategic competition, it will really be around geoeconomics much more than geopolitics. Russia is, of course, the exception, but Russia is now facing economic isolation and backwardness. What will China do? That's the big question, of course. If China chooses to team up very heavily with Russia, we will approach this constellation with two big camps, and sort of an authoritarian camp on one side, a democratic camp on the other side, and there will be competition for the third countries, so to speak. What does Indonesia, India, Brazil, South Africa do in that constellation? There is, of course, at the same time, a certain return of geopolitics as well. But if we really look around the world today, who are the actors reverting to geopolitics? It really is Russia and perhaps a few so-called rogue states. It's really Russia that couldn't compete on the economic playing field and turned to traditional, very traditional geopolitics instead to revigorate its sort of imperial ambitions. There are, of course, new forms of geopolitics at the same time that we'll see more and more. That has to do with hybrid interference, hybrid warfare, cyber warfare, and the likes. That's the sort of geopolitics that is becoming more prominent. And that sort of geopolitics goes with new risks as well. But I think there is far too much talk about return to geopolitics as if we were going back to a sort of traditional Cold War. And that's perhaps not the case. It will look very different. The last slide, implications to business, since this seminar is very much targeted to business. Corporate risk management frameworks need to really to be prepared for this era of geoeconomic risk. And that takes some refashioning of those established framework, because these are really risks that are quite different from the traditional country-based political risks. And we, of course, need to also rethink corporate risk management for this combination of traditional and novel geopolitics. And with that, I leave the floor to Heikko, who will explain a bit more in detail how that reframing is going about. Thanks.
Thank you, Mikhail, for the for setting the scene. What I would like to do with you in the next 15 or 20 minutes is to walk you through some of our main findings. But before we start with the main findings, let's perhaps start with 3 preliminary remarks, echoing a bit what Mikhail just said. Preliminary remark number 1, the state is back. Yes, the state is back, but with a very specific agenda. We call that agenda a responsibility to protect. A geoeconomic responsibility to protect, as Mikhail referred to in his presentation, evolves around 3 key issues: resilience, sustainability, and national security. So when Mikhail emphasized in particular national security as one way for different policy communities to align their efforts, don't forget that we have 2 additional policy communities that will try to shape this responsibility to protect in a very specific way. Sustainability, with regard to all aspects related to climate change and environmental policy, and resilience related to all kinds of policy measures believed to be important to help our corporate sector getting back and getting out of a crisis situation. The second point is this responsibility to protect has a built-in risk of overemphasizing policy action. The carrots and sticks, this is really awful. Sorry about that. so I don't walk around. I'll just use that one then. There we go. The risk of overemphasizing policy measures is a serious risk. Mikhail referred to the carrots and sticks in his presentation. You can easily overplay sticks, because if our response to every problem is sanctioning, we might end up in a situation where we produce counterintuitive effects. But you can also overplay your carrots. You can overstimulate your national economy. Many of the investments we currently see with regard to hydrogen power or bringing the semiconductor industry back to Europe might follow a good intention, but at least for the semiconductor industry, we're already quite close to producing the next bubble. So the question in the end is, if we overplay our cards on this very end, is this really smart policy? Or should we not, because we believe in market economies, and market economies are called market economies for a very specific reason, the market produces a signal. The market produces a signal for investments. But if we overplay our cards politically, we nullify this core function of the market. And if you look into the literature, there's a very interesting body of literature telling you that in strategic competition, competitors start to look alike. So the big risk in responding to China in the way we currently respond to China is that we might end up in an overall economic environment when we ourselves distance our policies too far from a market-based approach to economic policy. So the third preliminary remark then leads us directly into the core subject of our report, and that's the question: what in the end is in it for the business sector? If you're familiar with the management literature, there are the 5 famous forces of Michael Porter. All 5 forces will change fundamentally in a geoeconomic environment. The nature of rivalry in existing markets, the possibility that new players will enter markets, the risk that existing products, services, and technologies will be substituted, the bargaining power of suppliers, and the bargaining power of consumers. Every element of the 5 forces will change in the future geoeconomic environment, and that's why you see the Cal cartoon on this slide from The Economist. Geoeconomics always is a two-way street. So Mikhail said we don't know yet properly how geoeconomic statecraft evolves. Yes, in particular, we don't know enough about the consequences of applying geoeconomic statecraft on our own economies. And that was the reason why we started this project. At the beginning of this year, the World Economic Forum produced its regular risk report with a very interesting figure. It says about 85% of the respondents to the report are either concerned or worried about the outlook of the world. Footnote, I would really like to smoke the remaining 15% smoke because they don't seem to be worried, but that's just a bad joke. So the question for us is, what exactly are the reasons of concern that matter most to corporate decision makers? We looked at this question by producing our own geoeconomic risk catalog. We have been assessing literature. We looked into the annual corporate reports of 45 companies being stock listed in Finland and Austria, because it's a joint Austrian-Finnish project. And what emerged out of it is a risk catalog consisting of 30 different risks. Some of them quite traditional. Top left, for example, armed conflicts, regional instability, buying a bit into the gray zone between geoeconomics and geopolitics that Mikhail just referred to. But when you look in particular at the right-hand column, we also list those instruments that are at the heart of the current geoeconomic debate, and we wanted to understand to what extent the use of these instruments is being considered as a risk from a corporate perspective. We launched a survey right at the beginning of the war in Ukraine. We thought, wow, this is going to make it quite easy for companies to respond because now geoeconomic risk is really at the top of the agenda. Nope, that wasn't the case because everybody said now that we are at war, we don't respond to surveys because we need to get our operations up and running. So that was a bit of a counterintuitive response. Nonetheless, we got close to 80 corporate risk experts from 6 different European countries looking at the risk catalog. We asked all of them to rate the risks according to impact and relevance and preparedness. So we wanted corporate risk experts to reflect upon whether they believe their own companies are good, moderately good, or bad in handling these risks. And the findings of this survey are illustrated on the following risk map. What you see over here is on the one hand side the level of preparedness, and on the other hand risk relevance and impact, again always from the perspective of our close to 80 respondents. And you can cluster the risks in 3 clusters. First, type 1, cyber attacks, macroeconomic risks, and the failure of critical national infrastructure. These 3 risks have been at the top of the national security debate in most European countries for the last 10 to 15 years. Small surprise, or almost no surprise, that also companies believe that these are their key risks, but they also believe that they're quite good at dealing with the negative fallout of these risks. Type 2 risks, a bit more challenging. That is a pretty heterogeneous cluster of risks, but what is common to all of them is the belief that companies are good at preparing for the consequences. And listening to what Mikhail said, for example, about sanctions, I really wonder whether this assessment would hold if we were to invite more companies. The most challenging cluster is the last one. In this bottom left cluster, you find almost all geoeconomic risks. And what is important to understand is companies do not yet consider these risks as relevant, and they're also not well prepared to handle these risks. So, of all words, that's the worst. In particular, because they're not well prepared to deal with the risk. So in addition to our survey, we also talked to 7 corporate risk managers in a personal interview, and we'd like to share with you some of the findings from these interviews. Clearly, the corporate risk picture is changing. Let me give you just 2 statements from our interviews. One interview partner, for example, said it's clearly new to them that these days some countries are becoming no-go areas. You no longer serve a company, you no longer serve a country because you don't get an export credit guarantee, because you're not allowed to export your technology there, or because you might fall under a sanctions regime. From a corporate perspective, that clearly means if that market is substantial to your turnover, to your EBIT, to your R&D spending, no-go areas can have a fundamental impact on the way you drive your business.
The other response was quite interesting as well, because it clearly shows that certain policy preferences might not be shared by the corporate sector. We had one interview partner, for example, saying one of the biggest emerging geoeconomic security risks is carbon border adjustment. Because that company, of course no surprise from the energy business, believed that carbon border adjustment could be instrumentalized by another government, thereby trying to put extra cost on this specific company. So our own policy preferences might sometimes not align with the policy preferences of a company. And that's why we also say with our report that not every mitigation measure that is politically desirable is A, financially doable, and B, strategically wise. Nearshoring, Mikhail referred to it, nearshoring comes with a heavy cost. Nearshoring comes with the cost of reduced diversification in terms of partners, in terms of markets. So the question really is, do we understand all the costs that come with our policy choices? And perhaps one of the most important findings of our report clearly is that when you look at the corporate geoeconomic risk appetite and the way companies report about geoeconomic risk, there's an emerging gray zone. Hardly ever do companies spell out their geoeconomic risk appetite, and hardly ever does the risk report of a corporate annual report spell out in detail what is the consequence of a specific geoeconomic risk on business model, business strategy, R&D, human resources, capital market access. Most risk reports are like a kind of broadband antibiotic. Now, you just talk about all the risks that could possibly affect your business, but you don't really go into the detail. Of course, you don't go into the details because if a financial analyst looks at it and says, you might be affected by this risk, this could drive down your stock price. On the other hand, the public sector wants to have a fair assessment of how companies fare in this new geoeconomic environment. And that's why we believe, again, with a very nice cartoon from The Economist, we need to invest in a tool that advances joint situational awareness and understanding of the public sector and the private sector at the same time. The tool that we have been developing as a kind of blueprint and dummy in our report would support strategic level public-private dialogue. That's a recommendation that Christian will talk about later. So we're not talking at the tactical level, we're not talking crisis management, we're really talking strategic level decision-making and the question of what kind of information would be needed at the top level to advance public-private cooperation. Our suggestion is that this collaborative tool could be designed around 4 key questions. First of all, what type of risks matter and to whom? Second, number 2, what kind of action is being taken by whom in response to the risks? A kind of geoeconomic action tracker. Question number 3, if we decide on a specific policy measure, what is going to be the national impact for my national business and my national economy? Footnote, I don't know yet, but it would be better if I knew, because otherwise I'm not informed in taking a policy action. And fourth question, if we start mitigating the negative consequences of a specific policy action, who really benefits from the mitigation measures? So the risk map is what we have already seen. What you could do, for example, if you were using this tool, you could start to establish economic facts behind every risk. The problem is these days we hardly know which industry sector is most affected by a certain policy measure. Are sanctions on a specific technology going to affect only the respective technology sector, or are these sanctions also going to affect companies in other industry sectors? We don't know yet, but we should invest in providing the data to make a really informed policy decision. Second function, the Geoeconomic Action Tracker. If you ever try to follow by accessing specialized databases who takes sanctions against whom, and you want to take care of US sanctions at the federal level and at the regional level in the US. You have to look into sanctions of the European Commission, you have to look into sanctions of various EU member states, so that's a whole lot of work, and then we only talk about sanctions. So the idea of the Geoeconomic Action Tracker is to provide an overview of all actions taken by international and national authorities. And in addition, you might also be interested not only in the consequences of these actions, but also in a kind of public opinion media sentiment. Because at least in democracies, you need to have a public support for your policy decision. And if your policy decision is extremely critical and you clearly know you don't get the support, you of course run a risk of taking that policy action. The third element, which I think would be quite relevant, but most likely also challenging to set up, is the geoeconomic impact assessment. Before you say, okay, we take action against country Y, but the following companies in either Finland or Austria will be negatively affected, you need to establish to what extent these companies might be negatively affected. So the geoeconomic impact assessment would exactly look at the industry sectors and also the regional distribution of the respective companies in your country, because this is where the role of political constituencies comes into play, of course. And the final function would be a kind of risk mitigation radar. So companies that might be negatively affected by a specific action get support from your government. You might dole out subsidies, you might dole out tax breaks, but in the end, it's taxpayers' money. So you need to make sure that your mitigation measure is effective, and in order to assess effectiveness, you need to understand who is benefiting from the mitigation measures and to what extent the respective companies will take recourse to the aid that you're offering. That was, in a nutshell, our finding with regard to the risk map and the collaborative tool. And we also have a couple of more strategic recommendations that Christian will discuss next.
Oh, okay.
Minä
Yeah.
ajattelen tätä.
All right, thank you very much, Heiko. When I actually moved back to Finland, I was all the time told I speak too much and too fast and wave my hands too much. So learning from Heiko, I'm probably just going to stick to the providing a stationary target at this point in time. Anyway, so you've heard from my colleagues quite a bit in terms of why we should care more about geoeconomic risk and why we should take a more strategic approach to both improving our understanding and taking measures against or towards mitigating geoeconomic risk in collaboration with between the public and private sectors. So what I'm going to do in my bit here is to, in a way, summarize a little bit the recommendations that we have derived through our research. These are, of course, as always, in a little bit sort of generic level, but we hope that these will really provide some avenue for discussion going forward in terms of actually addressing geoeconomic risk in Finland, in Europe, and elsewhere more efficiently. So I guess in order to sort of provide a way forward, we kind of clustered our 6 recommendations into essentially 2 groups. The first one really kind of addresses the problem that has been highlighted several times so far, and that is this sort of need for a shared understanding of geoeconomic risks and what can be done about them. And that really, in the end of the day, really necessitates a framework that all parties actually can understand and they can subscribe to. So no surprise, we do recommend establishing a private dialogue. I think this is quite common in lots of fields. But as sort of discussed before, that need is really clear here. I think in lots of ways the businesses are in the forefront of geoeconomic impact, whereas governments really tend to have a more sort of central and significant role in terms of responding or putting in place geoeconomic measures in terms of providing regulation and incentives that can work to our benefit. And both have really their unique agency. So in addition to sort of businesses being there in the forefront, they are not just innocent bystanders, they also have agency. And if governments don't understand sufficiently the needs of the businesses and come up with policies and incentives that address their concerns, there's a threat that those policies and incentives will be suboptimal or even counterproductive in some circumstances. And at the same time, if businesses don't see these sort of policies and incentives as being sufficient, there's a high risk that they will actually resort to self-help, basically following self-interest, take measures on their own that are perhaps, again, counterproductive to national interest. So it is clear that unless both sides sort of work together more than they do today, we risk of sort of both sides being a little bit blindsided and us not being able to sort of provide a strategic response to this strategic challenge. So how that can then work, obviously, again, we feel that because this is such a new issue, and there hasn't been work in this field previously, there is a lack of sort of this common understanding, this common framework of thinking and addressing geoeconomic risks. So there is clear sort of need for that strategic level, generally two-way dialogue, both in the national and international levels. So we'll come back to that question actually a bit later. But having said that, even though a strategic challenge requires strategic measures, we should be also nimble and adaptive enough to respond to sudden and surprising shocks. And this may mean that whatever we come up with shouldn't be so rigid that we can't adjust and provide also ad hoc responses when surprising challenges do occur. The other aspect is often when we talk about public-private partnerships is that they don't just sort of come together on their own from thin air, but they do require often good public partnerships or dialogues, as well as dialogues between private sector participants. So unless those sub-dialogues work well, it's quite unlikely that you will have a very effective public-private dialogue. And then I think another issue that should be probably kind of almost self-evident at this point in time, my colleagues mentioned several times that geoeconomic risk and geoeconomic issues are by nature transnational. So if we kind of limit our use and our dialogues into strictly national context, we do risk missing out a lot and not addressing all the important issues or important aspects of geoeconomic risk. by limiting us into purely and strictly into sort of national point of views. The other sort of aspect is that we do sort of, based on the research, recommend conducting or commissioning regular geoeconomic risk assessments, and this is mainly because geoeconomic risks are still quite novel and they are dynamic, so they are not static, and we still don't know how they will, what type of sort of geoeconomic measures will still evolve, how they will be used in the future. It's quite context specific. So again, we need this sort of continuity in terms of not just having a static understanding of what has happened in the past and base our measures just on that quite limited view. But instead, we should really also think about what lies ahead, and as Drist sort of alluded in his speech, the future is not often a linear representation of the past. We need to have a better sort of capability also, of course, learn from the past, but also increase our understanding and our capability to have as much as foresight as possible in terms of how this risk will evolve going forward. Often when talking about public-private partnership as well, we tend to emphasize that it needs to be transparent, it needs to be open, it needs to be generally two-way. And yet we tend to sort of muddle into a lot of bottlenecks. And one of the bottlenecks is really that we are dealing with issues here that are sensitive from national security point of view, from the point of view of foreign and security policy. And authorities can't really freely distribute classified information to private participants, and companies also have their responsibilities keeping their competitive information confidential. So a lot of times where it's easy to say that the governments and businesses should share as much as possible, we should actually recognize that there are limits to this. And the earlier we actually recognize that there are bottlenecks and there are limits to this, helps us to actually go around them and manage to have as good as a dialogue as possible, given these limitations. And there's been a lot of, so we're not in general suggesting a lot of creating sort of new structures, reinventing the wheel, but there's been a lot of good practices in other areas that are also national security sensitive, such as critical infrastructure protection, cybersecurity, or here in Finland, for instance, security of supply. So what we are sort of suggesting is considering sort of leveraging on those existing dialogues as much as possible in order to enable a better dialogue also in geoeconomic risks. The other sort of set of recommendations really more concerned about those sort of flanking policies that we could have in place in order to protect ourselves and against geoeconomic risk and help us in operating in this sort of quite novel and challenging strategic operating environment. And one of the first things, again, I think we should sort of acknowledge that this is novel, this is new, at least based on the research and actually other research done as well. There's not a lot of existing knowledge in businesses or governments actually, but especially businesses about geoeconomic risk and how to mitigate and manage them. So obviously, if we want to have actions taken based on that dialogue, we need to build up new capabilities, new competencies as well. And hence we we do recommend that we should advance improving the proficiency of executive leadership in terms of geoeconomic and geoeconomic risks. Once again, we don't sort of suggest reinventing the wheel, but rather really suggest that this is something we should consider in existing frameworks, in existing cost structures and existing networks and institutions where we already address a lot of issues around national security, for instance, of cybersecurity or critical infrastructure or security supply networks. We already have the type of structures where this type of information could be disseminated also. And again, as sort of Heiko alluded there, in order to have that sort of based on something real, not just theory, it would be good to sort of utilize utilize the IBRM type of framework or tool in order to provide actually meat around the bones and come up with sort of real life examples, real life cases that illustrate how businesses have handled geoeconomic risk badly or good, what type of things work and what type of measures do not work. So making it a little bit more also pragmatic and practical and not theoretical. So these are practical problems. There should be practical solutions, of course, to them. But first we need to improve the proficiency of executive leadership in these issues. Then there's a big question that we notice, especially I guess when looking into the annual reports of the companies, we examine it, that there seems to be sort of fairly vague way of speaking about geopolitical and geoeconomic risks. When they are addressed, in lots of cases, they're not addressed at all. And there are some good reasons for that. Of course, listed companies have very specific, concrete reasons for not being super concrete, not being super transparent sometimes about these type of issues where there's very little certainty as well what the risk really is in the end of the day. So it's not incentivized very well in order to sort of highlight a risk with such great level of uncertainty, and that could actually have a very negative impact in terms of investor relations and thus even the bottom line of these companies. But at the same time, we really feel that the pressure is rising, and one of the good illustrations of this was actually that so many companies were sort of pressured to exit from Russia because of consumer pressure, not so much because of any sort of regulatory or other sort of formal reasons. So there is probably going to be also increasing interest in terms of investors on how companies see and how their companies are managing geoeconomic risk, and that needs to be communicated in a manner that is reassuring and is convincing, and that really doesn't seem to be happening at the moment. So there's again some learnings, lessons learned from there. Partially this also has to sort of include integrating geoeconomic risk into generic enterprise risk management rules, because or systems, processes, because those really sort of deliver SOX reporting and other sort of mandatory reporting. So you can't have two separate lines of communications, but not all companies still have enterprise risk management, or it's not very mature. Regardless though whether they have it or not, this is much like ESG or sustainability reporting, human rights reporting. It's not very pleasant to do. It doesn't always have such a sort of obvious sort of connection to business operations, but it's the right thing to do. And also this sort of logic applies increasingly to geoeconomic risk as well. It can't be ignored, you can't hide from it, and it's certainly better if you communicate in a convincing, understandable manner to your investors, your customers, consumers, and other stakeholders, how you see geoeconomic risk, how you manage it. So there's certainly a lot room for improvement there. And then in terms of the sort of difficult question in terms of how regulation and incentives can improve preparedness against geoeconomic risk, incentives are in particular very tricky. So is regulation in general. If it's not focused in the correct manner, if the incentives are not really genuine and effective, they can have contradictory effects. So we sort of highlighted a few possibilities that should be considered. But as the dynamic environment changes, of course, we think we need to also be innovative and come up with probably new types of regulations, new types of incentives. But some of the incentives that sort of came up were really tax breaks for investment in corporate resilience. So currently there is very little direct incentive for corporations to improve their resilience in general. There are some changes coming to this also on the European level. The Critical Entities Resilience Directive is coming probably before the turn of the year. Is going to improve this somewhat. But it is clear that there's a bit of a sort of gap between what companies would be capable of doing in increasing their resilience as opposed to how they get incentivized for it. And then in addition to public incentives, you should also consider private incentives. A lot of times it is in the self-interest of companies to also increase their resilience. If not for anything else, the customers both demand it and expect it and usually do reward for it. So sort of providing or incentives for, or seeing at least incentives for companies to actually increase their security, supply chain security, supply chain resilience should be something that should be improved. And then finally, we thought that, or we discovered that there's a lot of good information that is not currently utilized, and two sort of groups specifically sort of were highlighted, and the first one was financial analysts. So if we think in terms of different hedging strategies, for instance, against disruptions, there's probably a lot of good data there that isn't currently being utilized in terms of understanding and making more concrete these incentives for increasing resilience. And the other one, obvious, is the insurance companies. We've seen that sometimes insurance companies can too be very innovative. And if you don't believe me, then just think of, for instance, an example of cybersecurity insurance. We can have cybersecurity insurance and political risk insurance. Not so sure why we couldn't see geoeconomic risk insurance as well. But like I said, just to sort of finish up, these are the sort of ideas that we derive from the research and we offer forward for discussion. And as maybe the first sort of first for the occurrence of public-private dialogue, I think we're going to be followed by Timo. So maybe Timo will already provide us some views in terms of how this all sounds from business associations perspective. So thank you very much on my behalf, and looking forward to the discussion.
Before I give Director Vuori the floor, I will have the pleasure of introducing him. So first off is Timo Vuori, who is the Director of International Trade, Head of Trade Policy at the Confederation of Finnish Industries, which is the Finnish member of Business Europe. Since 2015, Vuori has also acted as member of the European Economic and Social Committee in Brussels, focusing on international trade issues. After Director Vuori, I will have the honor to present Director Toivakka's comments, as she unfortunately has fallen ill. And Lenita Toivakka is Director of International Affairs at the Finland Chamber of Commerce and Country Director of Finland for the International Chamber of Commerce. She's a former member of Parliament and a former Minister of Foreign Trade and Development. But first, Director Vuori, please.
Yep. Good morning or good afternoon, everybody, depending on which side of the world you are following this session. Geoeconomics seems to be on the lips of everybody, and therefore I was a bit late for this event, because in the previous discussion we also tackled this issue. it seems to be the case that the politics is back to trade and technology. And it has been there earlier, but now in a new way, like Mikael and his colleague explained to us. But before giving my 5 remarks concerning the business environment and also the business cases, I would like to congratulate Mikael, also Heikko and Christian, and it was also Edward for excellent job. This is a very unique job, I would say revolutionary job, which you have done. And let's hope that based on this job we can identify and create different kind of tools helping the companies in this kind of geopolitical mapping. And also thank you for European Commission to using your money for this kind of important task, and also for Austrian government to support also this issue. But okay, then my 5 remarks plus 5 remarks. First, concerning the changing business environment. First remark, we have been discussing about new normal or back to normal. What is normal? This is the question which we all are considering nowadays. We, like me, the child from the Cold War time, feel that are we a bit going back to that bad old days? But like Mikael explained, there are also new aspect of this new normal, and also the potential Cold War in economics. So I would conclude here that we are not returning back to the good old days before the COVID-19 and market liberalization. We are moving to the new dimension in world, and that also affects the politics, the trade and technologies. My second element here is there seems to be going on battle of values, and I would concretize this, let me say, the Western democracies versus the authoritarian states. And this will reflect many ways in politics, but also in trade and technologies. And therefore, the third element is that also within the business, but also in the politics, we have to consider the narrative of international trade. We have believed that the more we trade with each other, let me say, the more friendly the development will be. But do we have to re-estimate this kind of narrative? Do we still believe that more trade between the countries will tackle all the political challenges and also make the world better, including the human rights and other aspects? I am still a big believer to the international trade and openness of economy, because that's the only way how we can share information, support the people, and also put some pressure on the political sides. But the good example of the no-go countries, for example, Iran. I was there among those first Finnish official delegations visiting Iran about 5-6 years ago, when everybody was eager to go to Iran and find new business opportunities there. And what is the situation today? Nearly impossible to do trade with Iran. What are the next no-go countries? We are just wondering about that also within the businesses. The fourth element, that yes, public-private dialogue is needed. But based on my international and national experience, I would say that Finland has been leader in this area, because it's easier from the ministerial level to approach the CEOs of the Finnish companies, or even the CEOs of the Finnish companies can easily call the ministers and going to the middle level and lower level. So we have a tradition to have that kind of public-private dialogue, and that is also strengthness for us in the long term. I know that this is a different story already in Sweden and probably some other countries. And there is probably a lesson that the others could also learn from Finland, that how to keep that kind of dialogue transparent and open within the public and private actors. And importantly, we need that kind of dialogue in order to mapping the next level of our development. The fifth element, that in this kind of chaotic situation, we definitely need modern trade and investment rules. But it seems to be the case that the multilateralism is not moving forward. It means that the United Nations and WTO are not functioning in the proper way. It means that we are moving towards the regionalism and trade blocs. That's the reality that we have to face, and that's causing challenges for the companies, because companies have based their businesses on the global supply chains. But now the global is not the issue, the regional is the issue, and localization is the issue. Then tackling the strong the business need or business development from this excellent navigating geoeconomic risk perspective. I would conclude first that those companies which have strong business values and also strong code of conduct and can effectively enforce and implement that code of conduct, no matter where they are doing their businesses, are the ones who will succeed also in the future, even tackling the geoeconomic risks. Secondly, I also feel that there are certain similarities concerning the ESG and corporate responsibility mapping and the compliance exercise that companies have already done for many years. We have already mapping about human rights risks in different countries, and like Mikael said, that now those risks are more transnational. But the companies have already do that kind of mapping. But now the nature of the risks is a bit different. But still, I believe that companies can do it, and we could build up on the same good tools and rules that the company has used for the ESG mapping, adding this geoeconomic risk as part of their tools there. The third conclusion, which I also have, that business leadership, there's a new demands. Some of you here in Finland may remember when our company UPM-10 nominated our former president Martti Ahtisaari as a board member. I would say that was in a way a revolutionary decision from the company side. They were looking for that kind of expertise, which person which understands the geoeconomics. Are we moving to that direction, that at the company corporate board level there are more people with that kind of background? Or how about the company's leadership, top leadership, middle class leadership and expertise level? Do we have in the future different kind of people with different kind of backgrounds? I'm not underestimating the capacity of engineers, but we need the different kind of people with different kind of background and understanding of different kind of cultures as such. And thank God we have good engineers here in Finland, although I'm not an engineer as education. My fourth element is that from the corporate perspective in this kind of risk mapping or measuring the risk, the results matter, and of course it's always relevant how you can compare your risk and how measurable your risks are and what kind of conclusions you can make based on your risk and compared to the others' risk, because this is the relevant for the companies. And my final point here is that the companies can only act in those areas in which they have sphere of influence. So mainly in those issues which relate to their businesses. Of course, there are some areas in which the companies have some indirect impacts to the societies. But at the same time, the companies in a way have in many cases adapt to the new reality of geoeconomics and geoeconomic risk. And my final point here is that business is and will be always about taking risks. It doesn't matter whether there are risks in geoeconomics or business environment or any other issues. But once again, thank you for your excellent job, and this is definitely the one job that will create more debate and dialogue also here in Finland, and our organization are already making some kind of preparation for, let me say, corporate leadership level discussion also together with Upi and Mikael and others, to learning from each other and sharing experience and knowledge. So definitely I encourage all of us to continue in this kind of public-private dialogue also here in Finland, but in other countries as such. Thank you.
And now to Director Toivakka's comments. This report provides a good insight into the rapidly changing and ever-changing global business environment. Today, geoeconomics matters. It matters to business. It matters to states. The business environment is foggy and difficult to predict. Economic and trade policy, foreign policy, but also increasingly security policy are intertwined. State control in strategic areas is increasing. Governments, through regulation, sanctions and export bans, are defining supply and value chains. The level and conditions of interdependence are now being re-established, defining the critical high-tech sectors where decoupling occurs or can occur. Businesses are concerned not only about the global economic downturn and rising costs, but also about the sustainability of supply chains and value chains. Companies have reacted by seeking to diversify the risks of their businesses. While large companies have been doing contingency planning, know your customer, for a long time when operating around the world, smaller companies are less familiar with this. Increased accountability obligations reinforce the need for companies to better understand their markets and their supply chains, their value chains. In addition to country risks, companies also need to prepare for wider geoeconomic risks. Of particular interest are the disarmament, securitization, and balkanization of the global economy and their impact on business. Companies of all sizes need to put much more emphasis on risk assessment and on anticipating and understanding the geoeconomic situation. Businesses are building their future in the face of great uncertainty, yet economic decisions still need to be made. Businesses need to adapt to increasing government control and geoeconomic uncertainty. The need for information in business is enormous. According to the Export Manager Survey of Finland Chamber of Commerce, companies have clearly woken up to the need to diversify their production and value chains and therefore reduce their critical dependence on China. It's not an easy task. It takes time to find reliable partners who match companies' needs and values. 4 recommendations to go. As noted in this FIIA report, governments intervene in business practice increasingly. There is a clear and growing need for more public-private dialogue at the strategic level. There is a need for new structures on which mutually beneficial cooperation can be built. In a tense and uncertain world, businesses have a huge need for information. At present, this cannot be fully met. Joint public-private events and information sessions organized this year by the Central Chamber of Commerce, together with public actors such as the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, FIIA, Bank of Finland, have attracted thousands of listeners. While there is a need for extensive information sessions, the information needs of businesses are deeper, more regular, more strategic, and sector-specific. It is great that there is a lot of public-private interaction and cooperation in Finland. However, there are problems with the geopolitical and geoeconomic dialogue, which is essential for businesses. More comments on the recommendations on the other side. Recommendation 1, to establish strategic-level public-private dialogue. There is a need for a new kind of active dialogue at national and international level in response to the new global political situation. Information security must be taken into account. Recommendation 2, regular geoeconomic risk assessments. Regular risk analysis and geoeconomic risk maps would help to understand the future and to assess the situation from the same perspective. Businesses will benefit from this information. Officials and policymakers would have a better understanding of the global business environment and the associated risks. This requires a clear plan of objectives, sectors, and regions. The plan should be developed in consultation with representatives of the business sector. Recommendation 3, a framework for geoeconomic information exchange. This framework would be very welcome. Exchanging information about geoeconomic challenges is essential for public-private interaction. The flow of information is a major challenge, and current information exchange channels do not serve the private sector. The Central Chamber of Commerce and the Regional Chambers of Commerce, which together have 21,000 member companies, could provide a reliable network of partners with whom to develop a secure way of exchanging mutual information. And finally, on recommendation number 5, reporting on sustainable development, which is very important. This work benefits both companies and the society as a whole. However, reporting is very burdensome, and adding a new reporting obligation for companies in this geopolitical context is not realistic. Geoeconomic risk assessment is more advanced in some companies than in others. An up-to-date information flow and good cooperation with the public sector will provide more relevant information and facilitate risk assessment. It would improve business understanding and encourage better preparedness. Lenita Toivakka, Director for International Affairs, Finland Chamber of Commerce. So now we have heard all the presentations by the experts and the relevant stakeholders, and we will now open the floor for discussion. We have around 20 minutes, so I'm hoping that there are many interesting questions to the panelists here to answer. So who would like to go first and start with questions? Let's take at least 2 now first in a row, and then the panelists can answer them, and we take a second round of questions. First, let's start with Mr. over there, and then we move on to the left-hand side.
Should I press the... Oh, yes, I'm heard. I'm Björn Sundellen, a business journalist. I have a question to Heikko Buchat. You said that the state is back with the protection agenda, and that the protection agenda bears a risk of over-protection. I can certainly see that happening in the United States now, but what's the situation in Europe, you think? There is a heavy emphasis on, well, on car batteries, for instance, that we need to increase the investment in car batteries and in battery material. We also see emphasis on European chip making. Do you see the risk of a bubble here, or is this a natural way for Europe to defend its own interests?
Thank you, and then we take the second question.
Hi, this is Yihong Zhang. I'm a lawyer and researcher, and my question is for Director Wigel and also Director Vuohilainen. Sorry if I pronounce the names wrong. But so for Director Wigel, you talk about this new Cold War. Could you please share your view on what is EU's position in this new world war? So the US is clearly trying to decoupling from China. So in your view, is also that's EU's position, and does that position align with the public opinion in different EU member states? And my question for Business Finland's director is the researchers at FIIA has shared this pioneering research about the strategic level public and the need for the strategic level public and private level dialogue. I wonder if Business Finland is providing some practical level public and private dialogue to raise awareness of geopolitical risks among Finnish companies. For example, is Business Finland recommending this regular assessment that the researchers has mentioned, or is it providing an incentive for companies to take the geopolitical risk more seriously in their business? Thank you.
Thank you. And we will start with Heikko, please. The first question was on overprotection.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for that question. I fully agree. Yes, there is an obvious risk also in Europe, because I think the risk comes at least at two levels. No? We have 26 or 27 national governments plus the Commission, so there's a synchronization risk between policy actions being taken at the national level and at the European level. And I would also like to refer to what is economic policy all about. No? In the past, economic policy was about ensuring competitive advantages. And my big concern is that by starting to politically identify winner technologies and winner sectors, sometimes we might choose the right winners and sometimes we might not choose the right winners. I mean, we have been there in the past, in the 1980s, when Japan was the big, today's China was yesterday's Japan from economic policy perspective. And everybody said, look at what Japan's MITI does, they really identify, they do this and do that. My real concern is on the way to strengthen our market economies, we lose the market as a correction mechanism because we start to honestly over-subsidize all kinds of industries. And from my perspective, this is a fundamental challenge for industry because, and this is what Timo said as well, I mean, in the end, more and more corporate decisions are being taken by the government without the government bearing full responsibility for corporate profits or corporate losses. So I think hidden in your question is a kind of shift. If the government is back, and if it is back with a strong hand, it comes with an implicit shift of responsibility from the corporate sector back to the private sector. But in the end, companies are no charities. And I think we still need to at least try to remember that companies are no charities, because right now I think that the regulatory policy preferences are all policy preferences that limit the corporate leeway, whereas the current geoeconomic environment would require companies to operate on a broader corporate leeway. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And then we move on to Director Vigel and the question about the EU's position in the new Cold War.
Yeah, I mean, what we're clearly seeing now is that the US is clearly trying to contain China's rise to some extent, especially in the technological sphere. We have more and more of these export restrictions of high technology from US to China. Now, whether EU is aligned with that sort of technological decoupling from China, it's not clear yet. The EU is currently not putting the same sort of restrictions on exports to China that the US is, so there's a bit of a difference in position there when it comes to the EU. And for EU, it's of course an extremely difficult question. It's a difficult position that what the US is taking, because the EU is also very dependent on China in many ways. And we have a lot of common interests with China, perhaps a bit more so than than US and China has actually. So, and we've also seen the EU leaders go into China. So there's clearly a balancing act going on here. The EU tries, at least at this point still, to balance a bit between US and China on this. So the EU is not completely aligned yet with US. There are, of course, at the same time, I think, in a way, preparations going on in the EU. When we talk about open strategic autonomy in the EU and all those policies that goes underneath that heading, which are with the aim of creating more economic autonomy in the EU. That's, of course, policies that are not only directed towards China, they're also directed towards the EU, to the US, to make us a bit less dependent on the US at the same time. So this is really difficult for EU. There are efforts being taken to develop EU's own economic autonomy in relation to both actors in a way, so that the EU could go on with this balancing act going forward as well. It would, of course, there's a lot of pressure from the US on Europe. If this sort of sanction spiral starts really going on, that you see more sanctions from US on China and China countering with sanctions, there will be pressure on Europe to get on board with those sanctions, US sanctions on China. The question is whether the EU is actually strategically cohesive enough to do that. The EU has a lot of different member states with different interests, and we've seen many times before that it might be difficult to get that cohesiveness, especially when it comes to China, that can easily drive this can use geoeconomic wedge strategies to try to play member states against each other. And China has a lot of carrots to offer there, but also some sticks to use. So the jury is still out. Where will the EU position itself very much?
Thank you. And then Director Vuohilainen on the practical level dialogue.
Yes, yes, thank you for the question. I think that in practical level, of course, Business Finland we are meeting about 6,000 Finnish companies a year and giving services to them. And we talk these issues. We relay the message of the risk that there is in the world. And a good example is that we used to have an office in Myanmar. And when there started to be the human rights issues, we started already then talking to the Finnish companies that it creates a big risk for them. And they a lot of, I would say that a lot of the companies that we were dealing that time, they kind of stopped their activities in Myanmar, of course, of that. And I think that was very in that when the situation. I think that if we would have waited until it's a public information, it would have taken probably a year or year and a half for the companies to realize that. Then there was a question about providing this kind of a private-public platform. I think that the Confederation of the Finnish Industries is better for that, like Director Vuori said earlier, that they already have these kind of platforms and they can do this dialogue. So I believe that's the better address for that.
Thank you so much, and now we can take a second round of questions. So first Kimmo Sasi behind there, and then we take the lady here in the Thank you.
Thank you very much. We say that there are two systems. One, the Chinese system, which controls society in an authoritarian way, and companies as well. They are tools of the government. In Europe, we have said that we'll present liberal democracy, where companies are independent, they act where they see it fit, and the government doesn't control them. When they make agreements, pacta sunt servanda prevails, you can trust what they have done. And it's the scale of economy that decides. Now, when I see the recent developments and this report, what I've heard, so now it will be seen in Europe that the government must control the companies. They can't fight against the government, but they must do in accordance with the political guidelines of the government. And now my question is, does that mean that we are now going in Europe to the Chinese model, where companies do not fight anymore against government, and they don't have their own interest, but they always must act in accordance with the wishes of the government, and even it's recommended that they must understand for the future how they have to behave, that they behave accordingly to the wishes of the government. So my question is Europe going to the Chinese model, and what will happen then?
Thank you so much. And then we go here to the left-hand side, thank you.
Yes. Hi, this is Lula Rosso from the VTT, the Technical Research Center of Finland. And I particularly was captured by one of the recommendations on the dialogue between private and public players. And although the report is mostly about businesses, the technology aspects and the technology factor in the risk has been mentioned several times. So then my question is for the whole panel is how and when the research institute and university should be involved into this dialogue. And I guess what I want to get here is that the business risk or the innovation ecosystem actors have a big role to play for the competitiveness and also for the risk. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And let's start with Sasi's question on whether Europe is going to the Chinese model. And it was directed, I guess, against anybody willing to answer. So who will go first?
I can take that up. But I think that's a good question. I think we provide a very good answer in our report to that question, that we actually have three models. We used to have a free market model, or sort of market capitalist model in the West, and China had the state capitalist model. And those work very differently. What we sort of are driving in this report is that we're moving in the West not towards a Chinese model, but towards what we call a strategic capitalism, where there will be more state intervention in certain sectors of the economy, strategic sectors of this economy where there are security interests involved, especially technological sectors. So we have all these new instruments that are new state interventionist instruments for the state to gain more control of particular sectors of the economy, whereas other sectors that are not strategically important will be left towards the free market, in the free market model on framework, laissez-faire, right? That's not the Chinese model. The Chinese model is state intervention over the board in all economic sectors. And that state intervention is being done for very political reasons, not necessarily for economic reasons, often for political reasons, for the Communist Party and the leadership to have control of the economy as such. So that's a different model. And state-corporate relations are varied in strategic capitalism. They are close in certain sectors, they're very distant in other sectors. So we're certainly moving towards a new economic model, but not the Chinese one.
Thank you for clarifying that. And Heiko, please.
There's a really good, if you're still looking for a Christmas present, because it's a really expensive book, but I can recommend it. I mean, it's 150 euros for 170 pages. Ultimate Economic Conflict Between China and Democratic Countries by 4 Taiwanese academics and practitioners. The question is really, are we on the way to becoming China while fighting China? Oh? And what Michael said is, I think, really needs to be iterated every day when you think about geoeconomic countermeasures. Is this a task for the government to pick up, or is it a task for the business sector to pick up? Because I think our own strength is that we have various players that we can use to present solutions towards the China challenge. Sometimes, honestly, I think the China challenge says more about our own view of China rather than China's performance. And I think this strategic dialogue, which we advocate, and then I'd like to respond to your question on technology, nobody prevents us from being smart. Nobody prevents us from being smart. So when should an organization like VTT come in? As early as possible, because if you start cooperating with science partners from countries that you might frown upon, all of a sudden you lose the knowledge because your scientists say, listen, they pay me twice the salary, they offer me a lab that I don't have at home. And by the way, I will also be part of an ecosystem that neither Finland nor Austria or any other European government can compete with. So I think when we talk about public-private partnership, the research institutes are part of the private leg. And I think one of the recommendations here is we need a kind of technology road mapping exercise. Because the long-term question is, what is the basis of our strategic advantage? And technology road mapping involving companies plus research institutes plus the government are the response to the question, if you want to enter a new market, there is no market entry these days without the transfer of technology. But I will never ever want to transfer technology that emboldens my competitor. No? So I need to have all my technology ecosystem partners on board to say, look, it's fine for you to share technology X, Y, Z, but never ever touch upon technology A, B, C. No? That's why research organizations need to be part of this dialogue, and they also need to raise awareness for some of the negative effects that come with scientific cooperation, because all of a sudden scientists might be gone and knowledge might be gone, and we have to take care of that.
Thank you, and I sensed you also got into the second question. But the Director Timo Vuori, a short comment.
Yes, I would like to briefly comment all of the question, but also the research issue. The case is that the world economy is moving towards the direction which is different than we know. And that's a reality. From the business perspective, we understand that this global economy with division labor, market-driven investment, innovation are the best model. But there are other forces which are moving this system to the new direction. Case China. So far from the West, we have believed that China will open its market also for the Western companies. It has, but there are also many areas which China is more and more protecting its market. And China is no longer a developing country. Therefore, also us have to use the defensive trade instruments against China. Unfortunately, the economic sense has lost its importance in the world. In the Russian invasion against Ukraine, the economy doesn't play any role. It's like a suicide for Russia to have a war with Ukraine. Thank God, behind the EU-China-US relation, certain economic realities still matter, and therefore the USA is not totally fighting against China, because there's a big business interest also for the USA to having some trade with China and also with Europe. To Björn, that yes, it seems to be the case that the government has come to the market and they will not disappear after the COVID-19 and after others. But from the business perspective, we try to limit their role here, that they are not destroying the market as such, because we still believe that the market-driven economy is the best one. And my final point for the platforms. For example, in Finland, we are discussing about our dependencies with China. And I always underline that we need the facts and researchers to analysis before going to some political decisions. And therefore, I see that the researchers, whenever they can produce us useful facts, but also some vision for the future, are always helping for this kind of dialogue, because sometimes we business people have too narrow-sighted thoughts about the future. You can help us to find the bigger picture, and also the politicians to understand the bigger picture. So we need this dialogue, not only the private public, but also the universities and researchers and so on.
Thank you so much. And I guess we will be hearing a lot more about geoeconomics in the future as well. And we were consistent. We started a bit late and now we end a bit late, so apologies for that. Anyways, thank you so much for your attendance, and thank you for the online audience, and let's give a final round of applause to the speaker. Thank you.
Ai jaa.